The stagecoach rattled into Harlan Creek like a wounded animal, trailing a cloud of red dust that settled over the town's sun-baked Main Street with a kind of finality. And when the door swung open and Myrtle Hawthorne stepped down onto the hard-packed earth of that September afternoon in 1883, every soul within eyeshot felt something shift in the air, though none of them could have said precisely what it was. She was not what Harlan Creek expected from a woman traveling alone. She was not wilted from the journey, not pale from the long miles that stretched between this forgotten corner of the Texas Panhandle and wherever she had come from. She stood tall and deliberate in a dark green traveling dress that had seen better days but was kept with quiet dignity, her dark hair pinned firmly beneath a small hat, her brown eyes moving over the dusty street with the measured carefulness of someone who had learned, over a long stretch of years, to assess a place before trusting it. She carried one trunk and a leather satchel that she kept tucked close to her side, as though it contained something irreplaceable. She paid the stagecoach driver, thanked him in a voice that was low and composed, and then turned to face the town that would either become her home or her next disappointment. Harlan Creek was a small settlement that had grown around a bend in a dry creek bed, propped up by a cattle operation to the east, a modest grain trade, and the stubbornness of the families who had decided this land was worth fighting for. There was a general store, a livery stable, a barber shop, a doctor's office, a church that needed a new roof, a saloon called the Red Gate, and a hotel called the Whitmore, which was 3 stories of ambition built on a single story of practical foundation. There was a small school that sat at the edge of town, and there was a land office where a heavy-set man named Gerald Prout spent most of his days avoiding work. Myrtle stood on the street with her trunk at her feet and her satchel pressed against her hip, and she looked at the hotel's sign and walked toward it without asking for directions, because asking for directions meant starting conversations, and conversations in new towns meant questions, and questions were the one thing she was not yet prepared for. The hotel lobby smelled of tobacco and lemon oil, and the woman behind the desk, whose name was Ida Whitmore, looked at Myrtle with the frank appraising eye of a woman who had rented rooms to every kind of traveler and made up her mind about most of them within the first 10 seconds. "Room for one," Myrtle said. "I'd like something toward the back if you have it." "How long?" Ida asked. "I'm not certain yet," Myrtle said honestly. "I'll pay week by week if that suits you." Ida studied her for a moment, then nodded and pulled a key from the board behind her. "Back room on the 2nd floor. You'll hear the chickens in the morning from the yard next door, but the window faces the hills and the breeze is decent." "That sounds perfectly fine," Myrtle said, and she meant it. She carried her own trunk up the stairs because she did not want help, and she closed the door to room 7 and sat on the edge of the bed in the last light of the September afternoon, and for a long time she did not move. She sat with her satchel in her lap and her hands folded over it, and she looked at the window and at the hills beyond it, and she breathed slowly and deliberately the way a person does when they are trying very hard to hold themselves together. Then she reached into the satchel and pulled out a small photograph, creased along one edge, and she looked at it for a moment with an expression that was equal parts love and grief and guilt, and then she tucked it carefully back inside, closed the clasp, and set the satchel on the nightstand beside her. She had arrived in Harlan Creek with a secret she had kept for years, and the weight of it sat in her chest like a stone she had grown so accustomed to carrying that she had almost forgotten what it felt like to breathe without it. Almost. Charles Calloway had been working the Rafter H cattle spread east of town for 4 years when the new woman arrived, though he did not know she had arrived until the following morning, when he rode in to collect supplies from the general store and Ida Whitmore's teenage nephew, a boy named Bobby who seemed to exist primarily to spread information, told him that a lone woman had come in on the afternoon stage. "Dark hair, green dress," Bobby said enthusiastically. "Real quiet, didn't talk to nobody, took a room at my aunt's hotel." Charles listened to this without any particular visible reaction, which was typical of him. He was a man of 31 years who had been shaped by the land into something lean and patient and unhurried. He had broad shoulders and calloused hands, and a face that had been weathered by sun and wind into a kind of handsomeness that was not immediately obvious, but that accumulated over time. The way a good piece of furniture only reveals its quality the longer you look at it. His eyes were a steady gray-green, the color of sage after rain, and they were the kind of eyes that listened even when his mouth was not moving. He had grown up in Kansas, moved south following cattle work, and had found Harlan Creek 4 years ago when he had ridden through on his way to somewhere else and simply stopped. He had stopped because the land spoke to him in a language he understood, and because the spread's owner, an aging cattleman named Earl Haverford, had offered him a fair wage and a small house on the property and no unnecessary questions about where he had come from, which in 1883 in Texas was a kind of kindness that Charles Calloway had learned not to take for granted. He picked up the supplies he needed from the store, loaded them into the wagon, and on his way out of town he passed the Whitmore Hotel. He did not stop. He had no reason to stop, but he glanced at the front of the building the way a man does when he has been told something and cannot quite put it from his mind, and that was the whole of it for that particular morning. He was back in town 3 days later on a Saturday, when Harlan Creek gathered loosely around the general store and the barber shop and the area in front of the Red Gate Saloon in the way that small western towns did on market days, people moving between each other in slow orbits, exchanging goods and gossip and the occasional argument. He saw Myrtle Hawthorne for the first time outside the general store. She was speaking with Eliza Dunmore, the school teacher, a sharp-minded young woman of 24 who had a way of finding every newcomer to town before anyone else did. The two women appeared to be in the middle of a conversation that had moved quickly from introductions into something more substantial, and Myrtle was listening to Eliza with that particular quality of attention that made whoever was speaking feel that they were the only person in the room, or in this case, on the street. Charles slowed his walk without meaning to. It was not that she was beautiful, though she was, in the particular way that has more to do with how a person inhabits themselves than with any arrangement of features. It was the quality of stillness around her, that particular kind of stillness that does not come from being at peace, but from being very carefully controlled, and which to a man who understood the difference looked like something worth knowing more about. He continued past them into the store and gathered what he needed, and when he came out she was still there, still talking with Eliza, and this time Eliza caught his eye and waved him over with the easy authority of a woman who considered the introduction of people to each other a personal duty. "Charles Calloway," Eliza said cheerfully. "This is Myrtle Hawthorne. She's just arrived. I was telling her about the town." "Miss Hawthorne," Charles said, and he touched the brim of his hat. "Mr. Calloway," Myrtle said. Her eyes were direct and composed, and they assessed him in that brief moment with the same careful intelligence she had turned on the town 3 days before. "Are you from Harlan Creek?" "Not originally," he said. 4 years now, though. It starts to feel like your own after a while." "What kind of work?" she asked, and the question was genuine, not polite. "Cattle," he said. "Rafter H east of town." She nodded, and there was a brief silence that was not uncomfortable, but was the kind of silence that happens between two people who are each trying to decide how much to say. "Are you staying long?" he asked. "I hope to," she said simply, and there was something in those 3 words that was not quite sadness and not quite resolution, but a combination of the two that Charles Calloway felt rather than understood, the way you feel a shift in the weather before you can name what is coming. "Well," he said, "it's a decent enough town. People are mostly good." He said this with the quiet authority of a man who had been in enough places to know what mostly good meant as a distinction from the alternative. "That's reassuring," Myrtle said, and the corners of her mouth moved in something that was almost a smile but that was holding something back, and that was the first conversation between them, short and measured and charged with the particular electricity of two people who have recognized something in each other without knowing yet what it is. The next week, Myrtle found work. She had gone to the general store owner, a stout and generally decent man named Bernard Fitch, and asked if he needed help. He had looked at her with the skeptical regard of a man who was not used to hiring women for work that involved handling accounts, but something about the level, patient quality of her gaze had made him pause before refusing. He had asked if she could handle figures. She had asked him to give her a ledger and a problem and 5 minutes. He gave her 3 problems and it took her 4 minutes, and her arithmetic was flawless, and her handwriting was clear and precise. And Bernard Fitch had hired her to help manage the store's accounts and to assist at the counter 3 days a week, which was as much as his budget permitted and more than he had expected to offer. It was not glamorous work and it did not pay generously, but it was honest and it was enough, and Myrtle Hawthorne had built a life on enough before. The town watched her with the collective mild curiosity that small communities turn on all newcomers. People were not unkind. A woman named Hattie Prout, wife of the land office man Gerald, brought her a pie the second week. The blacksmith's wife, a large-spirited woman named June Dawson, invited her to a small gathering of women who met on Thursday evenings in the church hall to sew and talk, and Myrtle accepted with a gratitude that was genuine even if she spoke carefully at those gatherings and offered little of herself that she had not first turned over and examined for safety. The questions came, as she had known they would. Where had she come from? Did she have family? Had she been married? To the first question she said Virginia, which was true. To the second she said she had lost her parents, which was also true. To the third she said no, which was not a lie in the strict legal sense of the word, but which was the heaviest incomplete truth she had ever spoken. Charles Calloway came into the general store on a Tuesday, 3 weeks after her arrival, to pick up an order of rope and a crate of tinned goods, and he found Myrtle behind the counter, working through Bernard's account ledger with the focused concentration of someone who found genuine satisfaction in making numbers behave correctly. She looked up when the door opened, and something about her face did that thing again, that brief flicker before the composure settled back over it, as though someone had lit a lamp for a half-second behind her eyes and then thought better of it. "Mr. Calloway," she said. "Miss Hawthorne," he said. "I didn't know you were working here." 3 days a week, she said. Bernard had a gap in his books that needed minding. He came to the counter with his list, and she pulled the items. And while she was working, she asked him about the cattle operation in the way she asked about everything, with genuine curiosity and specific follow-up questions that told him she was actually listening rather than performing interest. And he found himself talking more than he typically did about the land and the herd and the particular satisfaction of work that was difficult and physical and real. "You love it," she said at one point, not as a question. He considered the word. "It's the kind of work that makes sense to me," he said. "I can see what I'm doing and why and whether it's working." "There's something to be said for that." "There is," she agreed, and her voice had a quality to it that suggested she was speaking from personal knowledge. He paid for his goods and loaded them into the wagon and drove back to the Rafter H, and he thought about her the whole way, not in a deliberate way, but in the way a song gets into your head and plays whether you want it or not. In October, the weather turned in the way that West Texas weather turns, abruptly and with a kind of theatrical drama, the sky going from clear and blue to a deep bruised gray in the course of an afternoon, and a storm swept through Harlan Creek that rattled the windows of the Whitmore Hotel and sent the chickens next door into hysterics. Myrtle sat in her room with a lamp burning and a letter spread on the small table before her. She had been writing it for 2 hours and had crossed out more than she had kept. The letter was addressed to a woman named Clara Ashworth in Richmond, Virginia, and what it contained was the kind of careful, measured accounting of her current situation that she had been sending Clara every few months for the past 4 years. Letters that mapped her movements without explaining them, that said she was well and safe, and still searching without specifying what she was searching for. She folded the letter, sealed it, and set it aside, and then she took out the photograph again and looked at it in the lamplight. It was a portrait photograph, the kind made in a studio, slightly formal. It showed a child of perhaps 3 or 4 years, a boy with dark hair and serious eyes, wearing a small jacket that was clearly his best, looking at the camera with the solemn dignity that small children sometimes adopt when they know they are being photographed and are not quite sure what is expected of them. His name was Henry. He was 6 years old now, which meant that this photograph was 3 years out of date, which meant that whatever he looked like now was something Myrtle could only guess at, and the guessing was its own particular form of grief. She sat with the photograph until the storm eased, and then she put it away and went to bed, and lay in the dark listening to the wind settle down to a whisper, and thought about the distance between where she was and where she needed to get to, which was not a physical distance but a courage distance, and she was working on it, steadily and carefully, the way she worked on everything. It was Charles Calloway who found her, 2 weeks after the storm, sitting alone on the bench outside the church hall after the Thursday women's gathering had ended and the others had gone home. He had been passing by on foot, having left his horse at the livery for a new shoe, and he had stopped because she was sitting very still in the cool October evening air with her hands in her lap and her face turned toward the sky, and there was something in her expression that he could not walk past. "Miss Hawthorne," he said, stopping at the edge of the walk. She looked at him without surprise, as though she had heard him coming. "Mr. Calloway, are you in town late tonight? Horse needed a shoe," he said. "Are you all right?" The question was direct and simple and held no expectation in it, and she looked at him for a moment with that considering quality that he was beginning to recognize as a fundamental aspect of how she encountered the world. "I am," she said. "I was just sitting with some thoughts before going in." He hesitated, and then because there was a bench and because the evening was not unpleasant and because he was, at his core, a man who believed in following what felt right, he said, "Would you mind company for a while?" She thought about it genuinely, which he appreciated, rather than just saying yes or no reflexively. "I wouldn't mind," she said at last. He sat on the other end of the bench, leaving appropriate space between them, and for a few minutes they said nothing, which was easy in the way that silence between certain people is easy from the beginning, as though they have already agreed on a language that does not require words. "How are you finding the town?" he asked eventually. "Better than I expected," she said, and her voice held something careful and genuine together. "People have been kind, Eliza Dunmore especially." "Eliza's good people," he agreed. "She came out here from Ohio 3 years ago and decided this was where she belonged, just like that. Some people know quickly." Myrtle was quiet for a moment. "Did you know quickly when you decided to stay?" He thought about it honestly. "I think I knew before I decided," he said. "I think the deciding just caught up with the knowing eventually." She turned to look at him with an expression that was almost a smile, the fullest smile he had seen from her yet, and even partial as it changed her face significantly, opened it up, let something through. "That's a very precise way of putting it," she said. "I spend a lot of time on my own," he said. "You end up thinking about things more carefully than you might otherwise." "I know that feeling," she said softly, and there was a depth to those 4 words that he felt rather than analyzed, a resonance that said she was not speaking about riding alone on the range but about something else, something older and more internal. They sat a while longer, talking about small things, the town and the weather and the work, and then she said she ought to go in, and he said he ought to collect his horse, and they parted with the particular quality of ease that good conversations leave behind them, a warmth that does not require explanation. He walked to the livery thinking about her in that involuntary way that had become familiar over the past weeks, and he thought, "There is something she is not saying." He did not think this critically or with suspicion. He thought it with the recognition of a man who had his own things he had not said about himself in the early years, and who understood that people came to their truths in their own time and at their own speed, and that the best thing a person could do for another person with an unspoken truth was to make the space around them safe enough that, when they were ready, the speaking did not feel like falling off a cliff. November came to Harlan Creek with a dry cold that crept under doors and made the mornings hard and beautiful, the sky a deep clear blue over the brown and gold of the grassland, the air sharp enough to make your eyes water when you rode into it. Charles Calloway rode into town more frequently than he strictly needed to, and if Earl Haverford noticed this with a private smile, he was enough of a gentleman not to mention it. The town had begun to accept Myrtle Hawthorne as a permanent presence, which is to say they had moved from curious to proprietary, which is how small towns adopt people they have decided to keep. Hattie Prout invited her to Sunday dinner. Bernard Fitch gave her a small raise after she found an accounting discrepancy that had been draining his books for 2 years. Eliza Dunmore became what might genuinely be called a friend, the two women walking together on quiet evenings and talking about books and ideas with the particular pleasure of intelligent women who do not often find intellectual peers. It was Eliza who first noticed that Myrtle was happy in Harlan Creek in a way that seemed to surprise her. "You look like a woman who didn't expect to like it here," Eliza said one evening as they walked, the November stars cold and brilliant overhead. Myrtle considered this with the honesty she brought to most things. "I didn't know what to expect," she said. "I've been moving for a while. I wasn't sure any place would feel like stopping." "Does this feel like stopping?" Eliza asked. A pause. "More than anything has in a long time," Myrtle said, and her voice was quiet and careful and very serious. "Is that because of the town?" Eliza asked in the tone of someone who knows perfectly well what they are suggesting and is making the suggestion with affection rather than impertinence. Myrtle did not answer that, but she did something that was even more revealing. She laughed. Not a large laugh, but a real one, a small and startled and genuine sound that came from somewhere honest, and Eliza smiled to herself in the dark and said no more about it. The truth was that Charles Calloway had become, in the span of 6 weeks, a constant and quietly significant presence in Myrtle's daily landscape. He came into the store on the days she worked and stayed longer than his errands required. He brought Earl Haverford's orders himself when he could have sent one of the ranch hands. He sat beside her at the community gathering that Harlan Creek held in the church hall in mid-November, a Thanksgiving celebration of modest dimensions, and he brought her a cup of coffee from the table without asking whether she wanted one, simply setting it in front of her with a quiet confidence that said he had noticed she always took coffee and never tea, and she had looked up at him with an expression that was startled and warm and slightly undone all at once. He was not pushy about any of it. He was never anything but gentle and measured and patient. And his patience was not the patience of a man who was waiting for something, but the patience of a man who understood that some things had to come in their own time, and that the best thing he could do was be consistently present while that time passed. He had said almost nothing personal about himself, and neither had she, and they both understood that this was temporary, that eventually the trust between them was going to have to be built on more than pleasant conversation and shared silences, and they were both moving toward that in their own careful ways. It was the 3rd week of November when the man from Virginia arrived. He came in on the stage, as Myrtle had come, but where she had arrived with quiet and self-containment, he arrived with the particular loudness of a man who was accustomed to making his presence felt. He was broad and well-dressed for the territory, perhaps 50 years of age, with a heavy jaw and small eyes, and the bearing of someone who believed himself entitled to whatever room he walked into. His name was Lawrence Ashworth, and he was Clara's husband, and his arrival in Harlan Creek on a cold November morning was the thing Myrtle had been afraid of for 4 years. She did not know he had arrived until she saw him from the window of the general store, and when she did, the blood left her face so completely that Bernard Fitch asked her if she was ill. "I'm fine," she said, and her voice was steady even as her hands gripped the counter edge. "I just felt dizzy for a moment." She watched Lawrence Ashworth through the window as he stood in the street looking at the hotel sign, and she watched until he went inside. And then she spent the rest of that working morning behind a wall of deliberate calm that cost her more than anyone in the store could have known. That evening she sat in her room and turned the situation over in her mind with the precision she brought to difficult problems, which is to say she did not panic, though she was afraid, and she did not run, though every instinct that had kept her moving for 4 years told her to go. She sat still instead, and she thought about what Lawrence Ashworth being in Harlan Creek meant. He was not here by accident. He had been looking for her. Clara must have told him, or one of the letters had been opened, or he had simply been patient and systematic in a way that she had underestimated. She had been afraid of Lawrence Ashworth for 4 years, not for her own sake but for Henry's. Henry was Clara Ashworth's son, or had been understood to be Clara's son, which was the fiction that had been constructed 4 years ago when Myrtle, unmarried and desperate and 24 years old, had done the most agonizing thing a woman could do and made an arrangement that she had been trying to live with ever since. Henry's father was a man who had disappeared before he could be told, a man who had been charming and irresponsible in equal measure, and Myrtle had found herself pregnant and alone in Richmond, Virginia, with no resources and no family and no options that she could see. Clara Ashworth had been her friend, her genuine friend, and Clara and Lawrence had wanted children and had not been able to have them, and Clara had offered what had seemed at the time like a solution, and what had revealed itself over the years to be a wound that would not close. Myrtle had given Henry to the Ashworths. She had signed papers that said she relinquished all legal claim. She had done it because she had nothing and he deserved something, and because she had believed Clara when Clara said she could visit, that she could be a part of his life in whatever form made sense, that he would not be lost to her entirely. Lawrence Ashworth had never agreed to that. Lawrence had taken the boy and the papers and had made very clear within the first year that he intended to raise Henry Ashworth with no complications, which was what he called Myrtle, a complication, and that if she attempted to make contact with the child he would use the legal system and his considerable resources to ensure she was painted as precisely the kind of woman no court in the country would allow near a child. She had run because she could not fight him, and because staying close was torture, and because Clara, dear and weak Clara, had not been willing to stand up to her husband in the way that might have made a difference. She had run and she had kept running and she had kept writing to Clara, hoping things might change, hoping Henry might grow up and Lawrence might mellow and time might find a way to solve what she could not solve herself. And now Lawrence Ashworth was in Harlan Creek, and she had no idea what he wanted, though she could guess. She spent a sleepless night, and in the morning she went to the general store and worked her shift, and at noon she saw Lawrence Ashworth come through the door. He looked around the store with those small assessing eyes, and when they found her they settled with the particular satisfaction of a man who has spent time and money on a search and has now found what he was looking for. "Myrtle," he said. "Mr. Ashworth," she said. Her voice was even. Her hands were still. She had promised herself last night that she would not let him see her afraid because men like Lawrence Ashworth used fear the way other men used money. "We need to talk," he said. "I'm working," she said. "I can speak with you this evening." He looked at her with the evaluative contempt of a man who had expected her to fold immediately and was adjusting his tactics. "This evening, then," he said. 7 o'clock, the hotel dining room." He left and Myrtle stood at the counter for a full minute without moving, and then Bernard Fitch came back from the stockroom and she asked him if she could leave an hour early that afternoon, and she went to find Charles Calloway. She had not planned to go to him. She had planned to handle this herself, as she handled everything herself. But her feet carried her down the street toward the livery where she had seen his horse that morning, and when she found him there talking to the livery man, and when he turned and looked at her and his expression changed immediately to one of quiet and direct concern, she felt something loosen in her chest that she had not known was tightened. "Something is wrong," he said. It was not a question. "I need to talk to someone," she said. "I'm sorry to impose." "You're not imposing," he said, with a firmness that was gentle and absolute at once. The liveryman made himself scarce with the good instincts of someone who understood the contours of a private conversation, and Charles and Myrtle stood in the cold afternoon light near the fence, and she told him about Lawrence Ashworth. Not everything, not all of it, but enough. She told him that a man had arrived from Virginia who had authority over something that mattered very much to her, and that she was afraid of the meeting, and that she did not know what he wanted. Charles listened to all of it without interrupting. When she had finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Do you know what he wants?" "I can guess," she said. "He may want to threaten me to stay away from something, or he may want something from me. I don't know which is worse." "You don't have to tell me more than you want to," Charles said. "But I want you to know that whatever it is, it doesn't change the fact that I think you're one of the most capable and decent people I've met in this town, and you don't face things like this alone if you don't want to." She looked at him for a long time. The wind moved between them, cold and clean, carrying the smell of horses and dry grass. "Tell me when you are ready," he said simply. "Tell me when you are ready to say all of it. I'll be here." Something cracked open in her very quietly, the way ice cracks in spring, a sound more than a movement. She nodded, not trusting her voice for a moment. "Thank you," she said when she had it back. "Go to that meeting," he said, "and come find me after if you want. I'll be at the Red Gate until 8. She went to the meeting. She sat across a small dining room table from Lawrence Ashworth, and she folded her hands on the table, and she looked at him steadily, and she did not flinch. What he wanted, it turned out, was simpler and more brutal than she had expected. Clara was ill. Not ill in the temporary sense, but ill in the way that people were ill when they were not going to recover, a matter of the lungs, and the doctors in Richmond had given her at most a year. Lawrence Ashworth had come to Harlan Creek to tell Myrtle this in person, and his reason for doing so was not compassion but practicality. He was 50 years old and he ran a business, and he was going to need someone to look after Henry when Clara was gone, and a governess could do a great deal, but a governess was not family. He sat across the table from Myrtle and laid this out in the flat, transactional tone of a man discussing a business arrangement, and she listened to it and felt the specific horror of someone who has been seen only as a function and never as a person. He wanted her to come back to Richmond, to be Henry's caretaker, not his mother, never acknowledged as his mother, but his caretaker in the house, under Lawrence's roof and Lawrence's rules. And if she refused, he said, looking at her with those small hard eyes, then there were letters she had written to Clara that contained information that, in the wrong hands, could cause her professional difficulties. He was threatening her with her own letters. Her honest, careful letters to her friend turned into instruments of coercion. She sat with this for a long moment, and then she said, "I'll give you my answer by the end of the week." He had not expected that. He had expected capitulation or argument, and she had given him neither, and the slight confusion on his face was the only satisfaction available to her at that moment, so she took it. She went to the Red Gate at 7:30, and she found Charles Calloway at a table near the window with a cup of coffee and a patient expression, and she sat down and she told him everything. All of it. Henry and the birth and the arrangement and the 4 years of running and the letters and what Lawrence wanted. She told him without stopping, without softening it, without making herself look better than she had been, because she was tired, and because he had said, "Tell me when you are ready," and she was ready. He listened to all of it with his elbows on the table and his gray-green eyes fixed on her face, not with judgment but with the full and focused attention of someone to whom every word mattered. When she finished, she felt hollowed out and terrified and somehow lighter than she had felt in 4 years. He was quiet for a moment. "Your boy," he said. "Henry." "Yes," she said. Is he safe? Is he treated well? She thought about it carefully because she had thought about it many times. Clara loves him, she said. Lawrence is cold and distant, but he's not cruel. Henry has had everything materially. He's in good schools. He doesn't know who I am. Does he know he's adopted? I don't know, she said, and that particular not knowing was its own small grief. Charles wrapped his hands around his coffee cup and looked at the table for a moment, and then he looked back at her. This man threatened you with your own letters to his wife, he said. Yes. And he wants you to come back to Virginia and live under his roof as a servant to your own child. He didn't use those words, but that's what he meant. Yes, she said. Charles was quiet again for a moment, and then he said something that she had not expected and that, in the years afterward, she would remember with the precision of something carved into stone. Myrtle, he said, you are not a complication. You are a woman who made an impossible choice in impossible circumstances, and you have been punishing yourself for it ever since. That man has no more right to your obedience than he has to the moon. She stared at him. You have rights, he continued more quietly. I know the law doesn't always see it that way. I know what you signed. But you are that boy's mother, and that is a fact that no piece of paper fully erases. And if there is any way to do right by him that doesn't involve surrendering yourself to a man who sees you as furniture, then that is the way you find. She did not cry. She had not cried about Henry in 4 years because she had decided somewhere along the way that crying about him was a luxury she could not afford, that it would open something she could not close again. But her eyes went bright and her jaw tightened in the particular way of someone who is holding something very large very firmly in place. I don't know how, she said. Not tonight, he agreed. But we figure it out. Together, if you'll let me. The word together sat in the air between them like something solid, and she looked at it with the same careful attention she gave to everything. You barely know me, she said. I know enough, he said simply. She went back to her room that night and lay in the dark and felt, for the first time in 4 years, something that was not quite hope but was adjacent to it, something that suggested hope might be possible, the way you can feel warm air coming before you can see the sun. Over the next 2 days, Charles and Myrtle talked. They talked at the store and in the evening at the hotel porch, and on one occasion walking the edge of town in the cold, clear morning, their breath making small clouds in the air. And in those conversations, he told her things about himself that he had not told many people in Harlan Creek. He had grown up with parents who had lost 2 children before him to illness, and the grief of that loss had shaped his family into something cautious and careful that sometimes felt like love and sometimes felt like armor. And he had carried from that household a profound instinct to protect, not to control, never to control, but to put himself between people he cared about and the things that threatened them when he was able. He had been engaged once, briefly, to a woman in Kansas, and it had ended not with dramatic rupture but with the quiet mutual recognition that they were not what each other needed, and he had moved on from it without bitterness, but with a clearer sense of what he was looking for, which he had not been able to put into words until now, but which felt, sitting across from Myrtle Hawthorne in the cold November of 1883, as though it might have been this exact thing all along. He did not tell her any of this in one piece. He told it in fragments across 2 days, the way you give someone water in small amounts when they have been thirsty for a long time, and she received it with the same careful gratitude, and in return she told him more of herself, not just Henry and the grief of him but the life before, the person she had been at 19 and 20 and 23, the woman who had loved books and had wanted to teach and had gotten derailed by circumstances and had been rebuilding herself ever since. On the 3rd morning, which was a Thursday and the end of the week she had told Lawrence Ashworth she needed, Charles came to her with a practical suggestion that was also, beneath its practicality, the most significant thing he had said to her yet. There's a lawyer in Amarillo, he said. Name of Warren Platt. He's a decent man, and he knows family law. I think you should talk to him about what your actual legal position is. Not what Ashworth told you your position is, but what it actually is. That costs money, she said. "I know," he said. "I have some set by, let me help with that." She looked at him with the particular expression of a woman who has been managing a loan for so long that an offer of help lands with the weight of something entirely unfamiliar. "I can pay you back," she said. "You don't have to think about that now," he said. "Charles," she said, and it was the first time she had used his given name, and they both noticed it, and he was still and quiet about that noticing, which was exactly right. "Why are you doing this?" He met her eyes steadily. "Because it matters to me that you're all right," he said, "and because that boy deserves better than to be used as a lever, and so do you." She looked at him for a long time, and then she nodded. "All right," she said. "Amarillo." She sent Lawrence Ashworth a note that afternoon saying she needed more time and would not be available to meet again until the following week, and then she and Charles made arrangements to take the stage to Amarillo on Friday morning. The ride to Amarillo took the better part of the day, the two of them sitting across from each other in the rattling coach, occasionally talking and occasionally not. And in the not talking there was something warm and familiar that had arrived between them without either of them having named it. The way the best things arrive, quietly and surely, and already feeling like they belong. Warren Platt was a thin, precise man of perhaps 45 who kept his office in a building above a dry goods store, and who listened to Myrtle's situation with the focused attention of someone who understood that the details mattered. When she had finished, he spent several minutes in review of what she had told him, and then he looked up. "The papers you signed in 1879 were legal and binding under Virginia law," he said. "You relinquished maternal claim. I will not mislead you about that." Myrtle held herself very still. "However," Platt continued, "a private adoption arrangement made without court supervision is considerably less rock-solid than the man threatening you might want you to believe, particularly in light of what you've described regarding his conduct, specifically his use of private correspondence as a coercive instrument. That alone, if proven, constitutes a form of fraud in the original arrangement, in that it suggests the arrangement was made under false premises, namely that you would be permitted continued contact with the child." Myrtle's breath came out slowly. "What does that mean in practical terms?" she asked. "It means that if you were willing to engage the courts, and if you had legal representation and documentation of the original promises made to you and subsequently violated, you might have a case for revisiting the arrangement," Platt said. "Not necessarily to reverse it, but potentially to establish formal visitation rights that he cannot simply ignore." He paused. "It would be a long and expensive process. And it would depend very much on your ability to present yourself as a person of stable and respectable character, which, given what you've described of your current circumstances in Harlan Creek, might be more achievable than it would have been 4 years ago." Myrtle sat with this for a moment. Then she said, "Would it hurt Henry, the process?" Platt considered. "If handled carefully, it need not," he said. "The goal would not be to disrupt his life but to secure your place at its edge. Courts in this era do consider the welfare of the child primarily." He looked at her. "He is 6 years old, you said." "He was born in April of 1877, she said. "He'll be 7 in the spring." "At 7 he can express preferences to a court, to a limited degree," Platt said. "It is not determinative, but it is considered." Charles had been sitting quietly throughout this conversation, and he said now, "What would it take in terms of documentation?" Platt laid it out. Letters demonstrating the promises made, evidence of her current stability and employment, character witnesses, a formal complaint about the coercive use of correspondence. It was substantial but not impossible. They thanked him, paid his consultation fee, and walked out into the Amarillo street in the late afternoon light, and Myrtle stopped on the boardwalk and pressed her hand briefly over her eyes, not because she was crying but because she was overwhelmed and she needed a moment. And Charles stood beside her and said nothing and put his hand very lightly against her back, not directing or moving her, simply present, simply there. And she dropped her hand and breathed in the cold air and straightened. "I have the letters Clara wrote me," she said. I kept them, every one. They say, in her own words, what the arrangement was supposed to be. Then you have documentation, Charles said. It's still a battle, she said. Yes, he said, but you're not fighting it the way you were before. They were quiet for a moment, standing side by side in the failing light. You said we, she said. I did, he confirmed. She turned to look at him with an expression that was open in a way it had not been before, the careful control still present but softer now, permeable in the way that real trust makes people permeable. Charles, she said, I have to be honest with you. All right, he said. I came here running, she said. I wasn't looking for anyone. I don't know that I even believed there was anyone to look for. I have been carrying this secret for so long that it started to feel like the whole of me, and I wasn't sure there was anything left underneath it that was worth finding. She paused. I'm telling you this not to push you away. I'm telling you because I think you should know all of what you are stepping toward if you are stepping toward it. He looked at her with those steady gray-green eyes, and there was no hesitation in them. I can see what's underneath it, he said. I've been seeing it since that first day in the store when you asked me specific questions about cattle work, because you were genuinely curious and not just making polite conversation. I can see it every time you figure out what Bernard's books need before he's finished explaining the problem. I can see it in the way you are with Eliza, and the way you sat with the ladies at the church gathering and listened to Hattie Prout talk about her husband's bad back as though it were actually interesting, because you have the kind of attention for people that most people only reserve for themselves. He paused. I know what I'm stepping toward, Myrtle. I know it's not simple. Nothing real ever is. The wind came up the Amarillo Street, cold and carrying grit, and she pulled her coat tighter, and he was close enough that his shoulder touched hers, and she did not move away. We should find the hotel before it gets dark, she said, her voice slightly unsteady in a way that had nothing to do with cold. We should, he agreed. They ate dinner that evening at a small restaurant near the hotel, a simple meal of beef stew and bread, and they talked about everything that was not Henry and not Lawrence and not legal arrangements. They talked about the things that couples talk about when they are beginning to understand that they are a couple, small personal things that are large in their implication. The food they preferred, and the books they had read, and the places they had been, and the things they had wanted when they were young and naive enough to want things simply. She told him she had wanted to be a school teacher. He told her he had wanted to own his own land someday, not a large spread, not ambition for its own sake, but a piece of earth that was his, that he could shape and tend, and that would outlast him. That doesn't seem so impossible, she said. No, he said. It seems less impossible lately. The way he said it, looking at her across the small table in the lamplight, left no reasonable ambiguity about what he meant, and she felt her face do something warm and helpless that she could not fully control, and she did not try to control it, which was itself something new. They rode back to Harlan Creek the following morning in the early cold, and by the time the stagecoach rolled into town in the early afternoon, they had agreed on the shape of the next steps regarding Lawrence Ashworth, and they had also, without explicitly naming it, agreed on something else, which was that whatever was building between them was going to be given the space and time it needed to build properly, without rushing, without pressure, without the weight of everything else crowding it out. Myrtle went to speak with Lawrence Ashworth that afternoon, and she did it alone, which was her choice and which Charles respected entirely. She went to his hotel room and she stood in the doorway, and she told him that she was not coming back to Virginia on his terms, that she was consulting legal counsel regarding the terms of the original arrangement, and that if he attempted to use her letters against her, she would use his own wife's letters in return, which clearly documented promises he had never intended to honor. The change in his face was instructive. He had expected compliance or flight. He got neither. He said with the cold precision of a man regrouping, "You can't win this. You don't have the money." "I have enough," she said, which was only somewhat true, but which she said with the complete conviction of someone who knows that the other person's certainty is a weapon, and that the best counter to it is certainty of her own. I'd recommend you speak with your own attorney before you decide what you want to do next, Mr. Ashworth. And I'd also recommend you tell Clara that I will be writing to her regarding her son's welfare, and that I expect those letters to reach her." She left him there and walked back out into the street, and her legs were shaking slightly under her skirts, and her heart was hammering. And she walked directly to the general store and went in through the back door and sat on a crate in the stockroom for 10 minutes and breathed. When she came out, Bernard Fitch took one look at her and handed her a cup of hot coffee without comment, and she could have kissed him for the simple humanity of it. Charles found her at the end of the afternoon and she told him how it had gone, and his expression when she described Lawrence Ashworth's face was controlled but not entirely, and she caught the brief flare of something protective in his eyes that he quickly settled back into composure. "He'll think about it," Charles said. "Men like that calculate. He'll figure out whether a legal fight benefits him, and if it doesn't, he'll look for a different angle." "I know," she said, "but it's not the same as before. Before I was running. Now I'm standing still and I know what I'm working with, and I have Platt in Amarillo." She paused. "And I have you." The words settled between them, and he looked at her with an expression that was full and steady and certain. "You do," he said. December came in with a week of hard frost that silvered everything and made the mornings crystalline and severe, and Harlan Creek pulled itself close around its fires and its people the way that small towns do in winter, the community contracting into something warmer and more intimate as the cold pressed in from outside. Lawrence Ashworth left town on the Wednesday stage, having spent almost 2 weeks in Harlan Creek to no visible result, and Myrtle watched the coach pull away from her window at the store with a feeling that was not triumph, because triumph implied she had won something and she had not won anything yet, but relief, genuine and physical, the loosening of a long-held tension. She wrote to Warren Platt in Amarillo with the details she had gathered, and a list of the letters she possessed, and she wrote to Clara Ashworth in Richmond, a careful and honest letter that was different from the letters she had been writing for 4 years, a letter that said things plainly rather than carefully, that said she was not going to disappear quietly anymore, that said she hoped Clara was well, and that she loved Henry, and that she intended to be part of his life in whatever form was honest and real. She did not know what Clara would do with that letter, but she had sent it, which was new. On a Saturday in December, Charles Calloway took her for a ride out to the Rafter H, not to the main house, but to the land on the eastern edge of the property, where a small rise gave a view across miles of brown winter grassland, the sky enormous and pale blue above it, the horizon endless in every direction. He had saddled 2 horses and she had ridden, with more competence than he had expected, sitting easy in the saddle with the natural balance of someone who had learned young, and they had ridden out in the cold morning in companionable silence until they reached the rise and stopped. "I wanted you to see this," he said. She looked at the view for a long moment without speaking. The land was bare and wide and austere, and very beautiful in the way that austere things are beautiful, stripped of ornament and full of honest light. "It's remarkable," she said quietly. "Earl Haverford told me last month that he's thinking of dividing some of the eastern acreage," Charles said, with a careful, measured quality to his voice that told her he had thought about this moment before. "He's getting older. His son has no interest in cattle work. He's looking to sell off the eastern portion in the spring." She turned to look at him. "I've been saving," he said simply, "4 years of wages and not much to spend it on. It's not enough to buy the whole of what he's offering, but it might be enough for a starting piece of it with a loan for the rest." He paused. "I've been thinking about it for a while, what I'd build there." He looked out at the land, what it could be. "Charles," she said softly. He turned to look at her, and he was not a man given to elaborate speeches, but his eyes were very direct and very clear. "I'm not asking anything of you today," he said. "I want you to know that. I'm showing you something because I want you to see it, and I want you to know what I'm thinking, and I want you to have time to think about your own part of things. But I want to be honest with you, Myrtle, the way you've been honest with me." He paused. What I feel for you is not a passing thing. It's real and it's serious, and it's the kind of thing I've never felt before in a way that I entirely trust." The winter wind moved across the rise, lifting her hair under the hat, and she looked at him with the full weight of her attention and her consideration and everything she was, the careful and the afraid and the hopeful, and something in her settled in the way a compass needle settles when it finds north. "I'm not a simple proposition," she said. "There's Henry and the legal situation, and I don't know how long it will take or what it will cost, and it may not end the way I hope." "I know that," he said, "and I'm not someone who makes decisions quickly," she said. "I know that too," he said. "I've been watching you for 2 months. I know how you make decisions." She almost smiled. "You've been watching me." "Respectfully," he said, and now there was the quiet humor she had come to look forward to, the dry, understated warmth that was its own kind of intimacy. "Respectfully," she agreed, and the smile completed itself, full and real and without reservation. She looked out at the land again. "It's beautiful here," she said. "It really is." "Yes," he said, looking at her. She caught that and did not look away from the land when she said, "I'm not going to run any more." "I know," he said. "I'm going to see this through, whatever it takes with Henry. I'm going to stand still and fight for it." "Yes," he said, "I know that too." She turned to look at him. "I'm also going to let you in," she said. "All the way in. Not cautiously and not carefully, but actually, genuinely in. Because you've earned it, and because I want to, and because I'm tired of being careful about everything I feel." The words fell into the cold air between them, and he looked at her. This steady, patient, decent man who had said, "Tell me when you are ready," and had meant it with everything in him. And he said, "Myrtle." And she said, "Yes." And he leaned across from his horse, and she leaned to meet him, and they kissed for the first time on that winter rise with the enormous sky above them, and the brown grassland stretching away in every direction. A kiss that was careful at first and then not, warm and real, and carrying 4 months of accumulated feeling in every second of it. And when they broke apart, her eyes were bright, and his hands were tight on the reins. "About time," she said, her voice slightly unsteady. He laughed, a real and unguarded laugh, and she thought, "I have never heard him laugh like that before, and I intend to hear it many more times." Christmas in Harlan Creek was a modest affair, but a genuine one. The church full for the holiday service, a community gathering at the hall with food and music, Eliza Dunmore playing the piano with considerable energy, the children of the town running between the adults in a state of seasonal excess. Charles sat beside Myrtle at the celebration, and there was nothing covert about it now, his hand finding hers at some point in the evening with the easy assurance of something that had been established. And the town took this in with the approving satisfaction that communities reserve for romances they feel they have participated in by watching. Hattie Prout said to her husband Gerald on the walk home that she had known from the very first week, which was not true but was the kind of thing people say and believe after the fact. Eliza Dunmore, who had actually known, said nothing at all but smiled privately and with significant satisfaction. January brought a letter from Clara Ashworth. Myrtle opened it at the breakfast table in the hotel dining room with the particular care she brought to things that mattered, and she read it twice through before setting it down, and then she sat with her coffee and stared at the window. Clara had written without Lawrence's knowledge, she said. She was not well. She was not as ill as Lawrence had told Myrtle, not quite, but she was ill enough to know that the landscape of the next few years was uncertain. She was sorry. She was sorry for what Lawrence had done and what she had allowed him to do, and she was sorry for the years of silence that had followed the early warmth, and she was sorry, most of all, that she had not been stronger. Henry was well, she wrote. He was a serious and clever child, dark-haired and intense, who loved to read and who had a gift for drawing and who asked questions constantly about everything, about the way things worked and why people did what they did and where things came from. He did not know about Myrtle. He knew he had been adopted. Clara had insisted on that honesty at least over Lawrence's objection. But he did not know who his mother was. Clara thought he should know someday. She thought Myrtle had a right to be in his life. And she was willing, she wrote, to say so formally, to provide whatever documentation might help a legal case, if Myrtle was truly pursuing one. Myrtle sat with this letter for a long time, and then she walked to the ranch to find Charles. She found him at the fence line, doing early morning work in the cold, and she showed him the letter and watched him read it and watched his expression as he did. He looked up. "She'll support your case," he said. "Yes," Myrtle said. "That changes things significantly." "Yes," she said again, and her voice was thick with something she was not entirely containing this time. And he put the letter down and put his arms around her, right there at the fence with the cold morning all around them. And she pressed her face against his chest and held on, and he held her back with the particular steadiness of a man who understands that sometimes what a person needs is simply to be held. She did not cry. She almost did. But what she did instead was breathe, long and deep, and something released in her chest that had been held for 4 years. A specific knot of grief and guilt and desperate hope, and when she lifted her head her eyes were bright but clear. "I need to write to Platt today," she said. "Yes," he said, "and I need to think about whether I need to go to Richmond." "When you're ready," he said, "and not alone if you don't want to be." She looked at him. "You would come with me." "I would go anywhere you needed me to go," he said simply. The legal proceedings were initiated in February, a quiet process that began with letters between Warren Platt and a lawyer in Richmond whom Platt contacted on Myrtle's behalf. The case was not fast, as Platt had warned, but it moved inch by inch through the cold months of early 1884, Clara Ashworth's written testimony forming the cornerstone of the argument, her clear documentation of what had been promised and what had been denied, giving Platt the foundation he needed to argue that the original arrangement had been entered into under fraudulent conditions. Lawrence Ashworth contested it, as he had said he would with all the resources at his disposal, but he was not prepared for Clara's involvement, and the calculation he had always made, that Myrtle was isolated and without recourse, no longer held. In Harlan Creek, life continued in its daily rhythms, and within those rhythms something grew steadily and beautifully between Myrtle and Charles that was in its own way the most significant thing happening, even with everything else in motion. They spent time together in every form that the town offered, walking in the evenings, sharing meals at the hotel dining room, attending the church services that Myrtle had begun to join not out of obligation, but because she found something restoring in the ritual of community and song. He came to the store when she worked, and she came out to the ranch on Saturdays, and she had begun to know the land the way you know it when you ride it regularly, learning its variations and its moods the way you learn a person's moods. He asked her, on a bright cold day in February, if she would consider walking out with him formally. The phrasing was old-fashioned and deliberate and a little careful, and it made her smile. "Charles," she said, "I think we are rather past the stage of formal walking out." "I want it to be named," he said. "I want it to be clear and above board and known. I don't want there to be any ambiguity about what I intend." "What do you intend?" she asked, holding his gaze. He held it back. "Everything," he said, "if you'll have me." She reached out and put her hand in his, which was answer enough for that particular afternoon, though there would be more specific answers coming in time. In March, Earl Haverford made his offer on the eastern acreage formal, and Charles presented his offer with everything he had saved, and an agreement with the local bank for the remainder. And Earl, who was 70 years old and tired, and who had a genuine affection for Charles Calloway built on 4 years of reliable and honest work, accepted it with a handshake and a warning about the condition of the windmill on the north end. Charles owned land. He told Myrtle the evening it was finalized, and she looked at his face when he said the words, the expression on it, contained but luminous, the face of a man who has worked toward something for a long time and arrived at it, and she thought, "I want to see that face for the rest of my life." What she said out loud was, "The north windmill needs work, does it?" He looked at her, startled, and then laughed. "Earl told you." Earl told Bernard, she said, and Bernard told Hattie, and Hattie told me this morning. You may not have noticed, Charles, but there are very few secrets in Harlan Creek. The specific irony of this statement, given everything, landed between them with a warmth that was also a recognition, the acknowledgement of how far she had come from the woman who had arrived in September with her carefully kept silence, and he smiled at her in a way that was entirely private and very warm and very certain. "I love you," he said. He said it simply and without preamble, the way he said most true things, as though it were a fact that had been true for a while, and that he was simply now saying out loud. She looked at him for a moment in the spring evening light, this man who had said, "Tell me when you are ready," and had meant it entirely, this man who had sat with her through the worst of what she carried and had not flinched and had not needed her to be simpler than she was. "I love you too," she said. "I have for some time. I just needed to be sure I was saying it from solid ground and not from fear." "And now?" he asked. "Now I am saying it from the most solid ground I have stood on in years," she said. In April, on a day that happened to be Henry Ashworth's 7th birthday, though she did not know if she was supposed to know that anymore, Myrtle received word from Warren Platt that Lawrence Ashworth had agreed to a negotiated settlement rather than proceed to a formal hearing. The settlement included formally documented visitation rights for Myrtle, twice yearly, in Richmond, under terms that were supervised at first, but with the provision that those conditions could be revisited as Henry grew older and as the situation evolved. It was not everything. It was not what it should have been, not what it would have been if the world were different, and if the law saw her the way justice saw her. But it was real and it was documented, and it was his agreement in writing that she existed and that she had a right to exist in Henry's world. She sat in her room at the Whitmore Hotel and held the letter and let herself feel the full weight of it, the relief and the grief and the complicated joy of a victory that cost more than victories are supposed to cost. She felt all of it without shutting any of it down, and then she put the letter in the satchel beside the photograph, and she went to find Charles. He was at the land, as he often was now, working on the small house that would be built on the eastern acreage, planning and measuring and consulting with a local carpenter about the materials. She found him there in the late afternoon light, standing at the marked-out foundation with a piece of paper in his hand, and when he saw her coming, he folded the paper and waited. She held up the letter. He crossed the space between them in a few strides and took it from her and read it, and when he looked up his eyes held everything she was feeling reflected back at her, the complexity of it, the relief, the grief, the rightness. "He agreed," she said. "He agreed," Charles confirmed. "I can see him. Twice a year properly with protection in the arrangement." "Yes." He put the letter down and put his hands on her face gently, the way you hold something that matters. "And he'll know who you are," she nodded, and her voice was very careful with the next words. "Clara is going to tell him, in whatever way she decides is appropriate for a 7-year-old, but he'll know." Charles pressed his forehead gently against hers, and they stood there in the late April light with the Texas wind moving around them and the new land stretching out in every direction. And she breathed him in and felt the solidness of him and the solidness of the ground under her feet and the solidness of her own life, which was under construction in much the same way as the house behind them. "Marry me," he said quietly, against her forehead. She pulled back enough to look at his face. He was watching her with those steady eyes, not anxious, not performing certainty, simply certain in the deep and settled way that was entirely him. "You're sure?" She said, not because she doubted him, but because she needed to hear it. "I have never been more sure of anything," he said. "Not about the land, not about anything." She thought about all the ways she had needed to be ready before she could say the true things, and she thought about how ready she was now, and she said, "Yes, Charles, yes." They were married in June of 1884 in the Harlan Creek church, on a Saturday morning with the summer heat just beginning, and the doors of the church thrown open to let the air move through. The church had gotten its new roof in the spring, something Eliza Dunmore had organized with her typical efficient determination, and it looked well and clean in the summer light. Eliza was there, standing in the front row with the particular expression of someone who has watched two people find each other and feels personally responsible for the outcome. Bernard Fitch and his wife were there. Hattie Prout cried through most of the ceremony, while Gerald Prout patted her hand with the resigned affection of a man who knows when he is outmatched by sentiment. Earl Haverford, who was not much for weddings but who had a genuine fondness for Charles Calloway, was there in a clean shirt that had clearly been pressed for the occasion. The Dawsons were there, and half a dozen ranch hands from the Rafter H, and Bobby Whitmore, Ida's nephew, who stood in the back and looked faintly thunderstruck by the whole proceeding. Myrtle wore a dress of pale blue that she had made herself in the weeks before the wedding, sitting up late in the evenings in her hotel room, each stitch a kind of quiet claim on a future that was becoming real. She walked to the front of the church without anyone to give her away, because she had no one to give her, which was all right because she was not being given. She was arriving, which was a different thing entirely. Charles stood at the front of the church in a clean dark jacket with his hat in his hands, and watched her come toward him with an expression that was not composed at all, that was entirely open in the way that his face was rarely open in public, full of everything he felt, and it was the best thing she had ever seen. The vows they spoke were the traditional ones, but they meant them in a way that had been earned, and when the minister said, "You may kiss your bride," Charles kissed her with the particular quality of a man who understands that some moments are the axis around which the rest of life will turn, and she kissed him back with everything she was. They moved into the house on the eastern acreage in July, the carpenter having worked quickly and well, and the house was modest but solid, 2 bedrooms and a kitchen, and a main room with windows that looked east toward the grassland and north toward the sky. Myrtle made it a home with the same deliberate care she brought to everything, and Charles worked the land with the deep satisfaction of a man who is working his own ground and knows it. In September, almost exactly a year after she had stepped off the stage and into Harlan Creek with her trunk and her satchel and her carefully kept secret, Myrtle made her first visit to Richmond. She went alone because Charles offered to come, and she knew he meant it, and she knew she needed to do this first part by herself. He drove her to the stage in the early morning and held her hand for a moment before she boarded, and looked at her with that steady certainty. "You know who you are now," he said. "Yes," she said, "I do." The journey to Richmond was long and tiring, and she arrived 3 days later at the Ashworth house, which was large and well-maintained and felt to her like the interior of a world she had been afraid of for years, and which was, when she arrived at its door, simply a house. Clara met her at the door. Clara was thinner than Myrtle remembered, and there was a careful quality to her breathing, but her eyes were warm, and when she took Myrtle's hands she held them with genuine feeling. "He knows," Clara said quietly at the door. "I told him last week. I told him he had a mother who loved him very much and who had made choices out of love, and that she was coming to visit." Myrtle's throat was very tight. "How did he take it?" Clara's smile was small and careful. "He asked a lot of questions," she said. "He always asks a lot of questions. Come inside." The house was quiet in the afternoon, and Henry was in the parlor at a table with a book and a piece of paper on which he had been drawing something with the focused concentration that Clara had described in her letter. He was 7 years old, darker haired than the photograph, taller than she had imagined, and when he looked up and saw her standing in the doorway his expression was the particular expression of a child who has been told something large and is not yet sure what to do with it. He looked at her for a long moment. "Are you her?" he said. "The mother from before." The phrase caught her, how he had absorbed the explanation he had been given and made it his own language. "The mother from before." "Yes," she said, and her voice was steady. "I'm Myrtle. I have wanted to know you for a very long time." He considered this. He was a very serious child, she could see that, and he considered things with a gravity that was somehow familiar. Then he said, "Clara says you live in Texas now." "I do," she said, "in a town called Harlan Creek." "Is there a creek?" "There is, though it's often dry." He considered this information. "I've been drawing the birds in the garden," he said, turning the paper slightly so she could see it. "I'm working on the wings." She crossed the room and sat beside him, close but not too close, giving him the space to move toward or away as he chose, and she looked at the drawing. The wings were remarkably detailed for a 7-year-old's hand. "These are very good," she said honestly. Looked at the drawing and then at her. "You can come back," he said. "Clara said you can come back." "Yes," she said. "I'm going to come back twice a year, and I'll write to you in between if you'd like." He thought about this with the careful weighing of a small person who takes things seriously. "All right," he said at last, and turned back to his drawing, but he moved slightly in his chair so that she was within the circle of his attention, which was how children let you in when they have decided to, and it was enough. It was more than enough. She stayed 4 days in Richmond, and each day she spent several hours with Henry, who had a mind like quicksilver and a serious manner that occasionally broke open into a grin that was so sudden and so complete that it knocked the breath out of her every single time. He told her about his school and his books and a particular injustice involving a spelling competition, and she listened to him with everything she had. On the last morning when she was preparing to leave, he appeared at the breakfast table with the bird drawing now completed and carefully rolled. "You can take it," he said. She took it with both hands. "I'll put it up in the house," she said. "In Texas," he said. "Texas," she confirmed. "Your next letter will be waiting for you when you get home from school today." He nodded with the gravity of someone who has made an agreement and takes agreements seriously. "All right," he said. He paused. "Will you tell me about the cattle?" "I'll tell you about everything," she said. She arrived back in Harlan Creek on a September evening, and Charles was at the stage stop waiting for her, and when she stepped down he took her hands and looked at her face and read everything in it. "He's wonderful," she said, and her voice broke a little on the word and she let it break, and Charles put his arms around her there at the stage stop with the whole town potentially watching and held her until the break resolved into something whole. "Tell me everything," he said. "I'll need all evening," she warned. "I have all evening," he said. "I have every evening." The years that followed in Harlan Creek were full. Charles built the ranch into something real and his own, adding to the herd steadily, working with the care and intelligence of a man who understood his land. Myrtle kept her work at the general store for the first 2 years, and then, when Eliza Dunmore moved back to Ohio to care for her aging parents, found herself stepped into the role of schoolteacher for the Harlan Creek School, which suited her as perfectly as anything she had ever done, her love of learning and her quality of attention making her exactly the kind of teacher that the town's children needed, and that the town, with some surprise at the perfection of the fit, gave her with full confidence. She was good at it. She was more than good. The children of Harlan Creek learned to read and cipher and think under her steady and warm guidance, and the school in the small building at the edge of town became something the community was genuinely proud of. In the spring of 1885, 16 months after the wedding, their son was born. They named him James Earl Calloway. James for no particular reason other than that it suited him, and Earl for the old man who had given Charles his start, and who had, when told of the honor, been visibly moved in the quiet way of men who do not show their feelings easily. James was born healthy and vigorous, and with an opinion about everything from his first moments, which his mother said was entirely characteristic, and his father found deeply entertaining. Henry wrote to them from Richmond with appropriate 7-year-old seriousness about the advent of what he called the baby in Texas, and in the following year's visit, he regarded infant James with the careful fascination of a child encountering something simultaneously alarming and compelling. "He's small," Henry observed. "He was smaller in the spring," Myrtle said. "Does he do anything?" Henry asked with the practical skepticism of a child whose baseline for interesting is considerably higher than infancy provides. "He smiles now," Myrtle said, "and he has opinions about everything." Henry considered this and then said, with the air of someone extending a significant olive branch, "I could draw him." "He would like that very much," Myrtle said, "when he is old enough to appreciate it. In the meantime, you could draw him for me to keep." This satisfied Henry, who got out his drawing materials with the efficient purposefulness that characterized everything he did. Clara Ashworth died in the autumn of 1886. She had lived longer than the doctors predicted, which Clara had always said she intended to do, and she had lived those years with more clarity and warmth than Lawrence had perhaps expected, writing frequently to Myrtle, watching Henry with the love of a woman who knew what she owed and paid it in devotion. The grief of Clara's death was complex, as all real grief is. Myrtle mourned her friend, the woman who had been kind when she could have been indifferent, who had been weak when she should have been strong, who had done the wrong thing and then spent years trying to compensate for it. It was not a simple grief, but it was honest, and she let herself feel it, and Charles held her through the worst evenings of it with the patient love of a man who has learned that presence is its own powerful speech. The question of Henry became newly urgent after Clara died. Lawrence, without Clara as a buffer, was a less manageable figure, and Henry was 9 years old and had begun to form clear opinions of his own about the shape of his life. When Myrtle made her visit in the winter of 1886, Henry had questions that he put to her with the direct seriousness she had come to expect. "Am I going to stay here?" he asked. "With Father Lawrence?" Father Lawrence, he called him, which said something. Myrtle was very careful. "That is a complicated question," she said, "and the answer depends on a lot of things, including what you want and what is best for you and what the law says." "What do you want?" he asked with that unnerving directness. "I want you to be happy and safe and loved," she said. "Those are the things I have always wanted for you, no matter what." He thought about this. Then he said, "I think I would like to see Texas." She wrote to Warren Platt on her return. The legal conversation that followed was long and careful, and involved Henry's own preferences being heard, which Platt had said was increasingly relevant as a child grew older. Lawrence Ashworth, aging and business consumed and increasingly aware that parenting a now 9-year-old with strong opinions was not what he had imagined when he had made his original calculations, was less aggressive in his resistance than Myrtle had feared. He was a cold man, but not, at his core, an unkind one, and he had enough self-knowledge to recognize that he was not equipped to give Henry what Henry needed, which was warmth and attention, and a parent whose fundamental interest was in the child rather than in the household's appearance of normalcy. By the summer of 1887, Henry Ashworth, 10 years old and deeply serious, and equipped with an impressive collection of drawing supplies, came to Harlan Creek for the summer. He stepped off the stagecoach with a trunk and a satchel, the same configuration his mother had arrived with 4 years earlier, and he looked at the town with measuring brown eyes. Charles was there to meet the stage, standing beside Myrtle with 2-year-old James on his hip, and Henry stepped down and took in the three of them, this small family unit waiting for him in the summer dust, and something in his careful face moved and settled. "You must be Charles," he said to Charles with a handshake that was attempted and very earnest. "I am," Charles said, taking the small hand with complete gravity. "And you must be Henry." "Yes," Henry said. He looked at James, who was regarding him with the frank evaluative stare of a toddler with opinions. "Hello, James." James said something decisive and unclear and stuck out his hand in imitation of the handshake he had just observed, and Henry, surprised, shook it, and Myrtle felt something in her chest that was too large for her body, a feeling that expanded outward until she was fairly sure the whole of Harlan Creek could feel it. Henry spent the summer, and then came back the following summer, and the summer after that, and each time he came back he stayed a little longer and left a little harder. Lawrence, who had remarried in 1888 to a woman who had her own children and her own household priorities, raised fewer and fewer objections to the extended arrangements, and by the time Henry was 12, the visits had become something closer to home than visits. The formal legal arrangement that shifted Henry's primary residence to Harlan Creek happened in 1890, when Henry was 13, in a proceeding that Platt handled with care, and that concluded with Henry sitting in a lawyer's office in Amarillo, saying clearly and with complete composure that he wished to live with Myrtle and Charles Calloway, and the judge, reviewing the entire history of the case, agreeing that this was in the child's best interest. Henry came home on the stage in October of 1890, a trunk and a satchel, the same as always, but this time there was no return ticket. He walked into the house on the eastern acreage in the late afternoon light and went to the room that had been kept ready for him, the one with the east-facing window, and set his things down, and came back to the kitchen where Myrtle was making dinner and stood in the doorway for a moment. "I'm home," he said. He said it with the careful precision of someone who is testing the weight of words, making sure they bear what he wants them to bear. "Yes," Myrtle said. She turned from the stove and looked at her son. He was 13 years old and tall for his age, dark-haired and serious with the grin that could still catch her off guard when it arrived. "You have been for a long time. We were just waiting for the paperwork to catch up." He laughed, a real laugh, and James, 6 years old and devoted to Henry in the particular way of younger siblings who have decided an older sibling is essentially a deity, came careening in from the yard and attached himself to Henry's side, and Henry slung an arm around him with the easy affection of a boy who has decided, in his careful and deliberate way, to belong here. Charles came in from the range at supper time, and the four of them sat around the kitchen table and ate together, and the conversation was ordinary and full and comfortable, Henry and James arguing about something with the competitive energy of brothers, Myrtle and Charles exchanging the small domestic communication of people who have built a life together and know its rhythms. And in the lamplight of that Texas evening everything was exactly what it should be. In the years that followed, Harlan Creek grew modestly, as small towns on the Texas Panhandle grew in the last decades of the 19th century, new families arriving, new businesses establishing themselves, the community deepening and widening around its core of people who had been there from the early days. The school that Myrtle taught expanded with the population, and she argued for and won a second teacher's position, filling it with a young man from Kansas who brought geometry and basic sciences with the same enthusiasm she brought to reading and history and arithmetic. Henry Calloway, as he came to be known, though Lawrence Ashworth's name was never legally removed, and he kept both, grew into someone remarkable. His gift for drawing developed into something serious and skilled, and Charles, who understood the value of real ability, arranged for him to spend a summer apprentice to an artist in Fort Worth who taught him the technical foundations his natural talent needed to flourish. Henry returned from that summer with new skills and a broader world in his eyes, and over the following years he built a small reputation for his work, particularly his paintings of the Texas landscape, which captured something about the light and the space that made people stop and look and feel they were there. He was 18 when he went to study formally in Austin, and he went with Myrtle's letters and Charles's handshake and James's loudly expressed opinion that Henry was being unreasonably dramatic about it since it was only Austin. He wrote every week with the faithful precision of someone for whom correspondence was a practiced and valued discipline, and came home for Christmas and summers, and the house on the eastern acreage was always where he landed. In 1893, a second child was born to Charles and Myrtle, a daughter they named Clara, not without a discussion and not without tears, named for the woman who had been imperfect and kind, and whose decisions had shaped all their lives. Clara Calloway arrived in April, like her half-brother Henry in some cosmic rhyme, and was from her first moments a person of considerable spirit and definite views, which James, now 8 years old, regarded as both exciting and exhausting, and which Charles watched with the particular delight of a man who already loved strong women and had simply been given another one. The ranch by this time was well established and well regarded, Charles's methods and his care for his land and his animals having built him a reputation in the county that translated into fair prices and good relationships. He had hired 2 permanent hands and brought in seasonal help during busy periods, and the small house had been added to, not grandly but thoughtfully, a bigger kitchen and an extra room that the growing family had needed. On a summer evening in 1895, Charles and Myrtle sat on the porch of the house they had built together, the grassland turning gold in the late light, James 15 years old, and somewhere on the north fence doing work he had taken on himself with the self-sufficient pride of a teenage boy, Clara 2 years old and asleep inside, and Henry's most recent letter in Myrtle's hand, describing a commission he had received to paint a series of landscapes for a collector in Dallas who had found his work remarkable. "He sounds happy," Charles said. "He is," Myrtle said. "I can hear it between the words." "He gets that from you," Charles said. "The capacity to be actually happy rather than just comfortable." She looked at him. "I learned it here," she said. "I didn't come with it." He reached across and took her hand where it rested on the arm of the porch chair, and held it, and they sat in the evening quiet with the land all around them and the sky going deeper blue above. And Myrtle thought about the woman who had stepped off the stage 12 years ago with a secret in her chest and a photograph in her satchel, afraid and alone, and running out of places to run to. And how that woman had sat on a church bench in October and been found by a man who said, "Tell me when you are ready." And how she had been ready eventually, and how ready had turned out to be not an ending but a beginning. "Do you know what I was thinking about today?" she said. "Tell me," he said. "The rise," she said. "That morning you took me out to see the land, before any of it, before the legal proceedings and the letters and Henry and James and any of it. Just us on that rise in the winter and you showing me something you loved and wanting me to see it." He was quiet for a moment, listening. "I knew then," she said, "or something very close to knowing. I think I knew that you were the kind of man I could trust with the whole of what I was, not just the parts that were easy." "You weren't wrong," he said simply. "No," she agreed, "I wasn't." The night came over the grassland gently, the stars appearing one by one in the deepening sky, and inside the house Clara woke and made a small sound and settled again into sleep. And James came in from the fence calling something about the north windmill, which Charles had fixed twice, and which appeared to be a permanent character in the landscape of their life on this land, always in need of attention, always holding. Myrtle stood from her chair and Charles stood with her, and she turned to look at him in the last light. This man who had taught her that patience was a form of love, and that waiting for readiness was not weakness but respect. And she kissed him on the porch of their house in the evening of a day that was ordinary and full and exactly enough. "Come in," she said. "Coming," he said, and followed her inside, into the light and the warmth and the complicated, beautiful, ordinary life they had built together from 2 people who had each been carrying something too heavy and had found, in each other, the reason to finally set it down. In the years that continued after that summer evening, Henry Calloway became a painter of genuine note. His work hung in collections in Dallas and Austin, and eventually beyond. His name known in circles that would have astonished the serious little boy who had looked at Myrtle in a Richmond parlor and said, "Are you her?" He came home for every Christmas without exception, and when he was 23, he brought a young woman named Adeline with him, a schoolteacher from Austin with gray eyes and an easy laugh, and introduced her around the kitchen table with the particular manner of a man presenting something important and hoping it will be received well. It was received very well. James, who was 19 by then and had his father's steadiness and his mother's sharp attention, liked her immediately. Clara, who was 7 and had opinions about everything, announced that Adeline had nice hands, which was apparently the highest compliment available. Myrtle watched her eldest son across the dinner table, watched the way he was when Adeline laughed, the way his careful, serious face opened up, and she felt something she could not quite name that was composed of equal parts pride and joy, and the particular satisfaction of seeing a pattern of love repeated into a new generation. Charles and Henry sat on the porch after dinner, the two of them with cups of coffee, and Myrtle watched them from the kitchen window while she and Adeline dried dishes together and talked about teaching. And what she saw on the porch was a father and a son, which had not been the given of either of their stories, but which was the truest thing she knew. The new century came to Harlan Creek with its own changes and its own challenges, and Charles and Myrtle Calloway moved through those changes with the steadiness that had always been the foundation of what they were, individually and together. The ranch adapted and the school grew, and the town evolved around them. And through all of it, the house on the eastern acreage remained what it had been from the beginning, the place where people came back to. James married in 1901, a practical and warm-hearted young woman from a neighboring ranch named Ruth, and they added their own room to the east side of the house when they came back to work the land beside Charles. And the kitchen at holiday times became a magnificent managed chaos that Myrtle surveyed with the expression of someone who has spent years making things work, and is now watching the fruits of that labor move through the world making their own things work. Clara grew up fierce and bright and went to school in Amarillo, and then to a teaching college in Fort Worth, and wrote home in letters that crackled with the energy of a young woman discovering the full extent of her own mind, and came back summers and holidays, and did not stay, which was exactly right, because she was the kind of person who needed more world than Harlan Creek contained, though Harlan Creek was always home. When Charles and Myrtle's grandchildren arrived, as they did in the natural course of years, they arrived into a world that was known and loved and secured, a world with a house on a rise above the grassland where the windmill stood repaired, and the evenings came in gold, and the stories got told, and the people in them were real and imperfect and deeply loved. And the story that got told most often in various versions, by various people, by Henry who told it with the artist's attention to light and detail, by James who told it with the rancher's attention to weather and ground, by Clara who told it with the teacher's attention to the lesson underneath, was the story of a woman who had arrived in town one September afternoon with a secret she had kept for years, stepping off a stagecoach with her trunk and her satchel and her carefully held heart. And of the cowboy who had found her on a bench outside the church hall and who had said, with the quiet certainty that was the whole of who he was, "Tell me when you are ready," and who had meant it, and who had waited, and to whom she had come when she was ready, with everything she was. Myrtle Calloway lived to see her grandchildren grow tall. She kept teaching in the Harlan Creek school until she was past 60, and the students she taught carried what she gave them out into the world and passed it forward in the way that good teaching passes forward, invisibly and permanently. She kept Henry's bird drawing in a frame on the east wall of the kitchen, faded now with years, the wings rendered with the careful attention of a 7-year-old who had been working on getting them right, and she looked at it every morning with the particular fullness of someone who knows what a thing cost and loves it more for the cost. Charles Calloway worked his land until he was old enough that James had to argue with him about taking things easier, and he argued back with the good-natured stubbornness of a man who has never found the distinction between working and living very clear, because to him the land was both. His hair went gray, and his hands grew more calloused, and his eyes remained exactly the same shade of sage after rain, and he looked at his wife across rooms and tables and porches and decades with the same steady certainty that he had looked at her across a store counter in 1883, when she had asked him direct questions about cattle work, and he had found himself thinking about a person in a way he could not stop. On an evening in the early years of the new century, they were alone on the porch in the way they had been many times before, the ranch quiet, the grandchildren in the house with James and Ruth, the stars arriving in their familiar patterns above the grassland, and Myrtle said, "I have been thinking about that first night I told you everything." "In the Red Gate," he said. Yes, I was so afraid and I was so tired, and I told you all of it and waited to see what you would do. And what did I do? He asked, though he knew. You said that boy deserves better than to be used as a lever, she said, and so do you. She paused. That was the moment, I think. Not the first conversation, not even the morning on the rise. That moment in the red gate when you said that. Why that moment, he asked. She thought about it with the care she gave to true things. Because you were angry on my behalf, she said. Not performing it, not using it to look good. Actually angry because something unjust had been done and it mattered to you that it had. And I thought, this is a man whose anger comes from the same place as his love, both of them real. Both of them for the same reasons. She looked at him. I had never had anyone angry on my behalf before, not like that. He was quiet for a moment, then he said, I would do it again, every part of it. I know, she said. That's the thing, Charles. I've always known that about you. From the very beginning, I knew that whatever you offered, you meant. The night settled over the grassland, and the stars were bright and steady overhead. The same stars that had watched over this land for centuries before either of them arrived. The same stars that would watch long after, indifferent and brilliant and beautiful in their vast remove. And below them, on a porch on a rise above a dry creek bed in the Texas Panhandle, two people sat together in the particular stillness of those who have nothing left unspoken between them, nothing kept, nothing hidden, nothing held back, and the feeling of that, the feeling of being known entirely by the person beside you and choosing to stay, and being chosen, is the kind of feeling that is too large for language, but which speaks itself in the quality of silence between two people on a porch in the evening, the hands touching, the breathing easy, the world full and complete and closed and warm.